Hello, Shemai, Croeso, and welcome to DisElectAbility, the Disability Politics podcast hosted by me, Autistic. To start this episode, I want to shed light on something that in this series of the DisElectAbility podcast, me, you, the listener, and my guests will be regularly discussing on this podcast, with this podcast honing in primarily on British politics. We will be discussing what the podcast began to deliver to discuss a year ago when we launched this programme. This show launched with the conversations with people such as Brendan Roberts from the Liberal Democrats discussing local party politics, state of health and care system here in Wales, Keir McCarthy, a youth disability activist, about mobilising a disabled vote at the last general election, and exploring how disabled people can be involved and represented in politics. And with Paula Peters, as I said, it's important that we are discussing this on this podcast, as people have questions that they wish to be asked and answered, and which is something I hope to do, to be able to make sense, but also hear and represent the comments, your views as disabled people are making, so that there is a platform and space for these things to be represented, because sometimes you don't find these are represented in the media in a fair, empathetic, sympathetic manner to interests of disabled people. And this matter is most likely the salient issue of disabled people at the minute here in Britain, to talk about the economics of the policies around benefits for performance, to changes to PIP, changes to what it means to be getting accessibility to work and accessible independent living. But what many people are seeing is economics of echoes of the harsh economic policies from 15 years ago, creating harsh economic hardships that cause poverty for many, with growing dependence on food banks, with the state of social inequalities haven't been repaired from the legacy of the Conservative government. We have a Labour government singing the same book with what is called the disability poll tax, echoing similar policies from the Conservative administration, whether that's from Osborne to, and Osborne, Cameron and Theresa May and such. During the first 5 years of the 2010s, the British government was a coalition between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and under that coalition is when the disabled people against cuts group that Paula Peters is a part of was founded, and it was founded on the basis of that campaign against the immediate economic austerity policies which followed the emergency budget that was introduced in 2010 after the words off from the election. This came up after post the economic crash of the late 2000s, and as I said, in that coalition it was between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. And on social media, from what you might have already seen from myself, that in an act of transparency I am saying that I am a member of the Liberal Democrats, and in this podcast I try to be fair and critical of all parties and offer some sense of balance, honesty and humility with you, and allow you the space to respond and question anything I might say and any opinions you might have, as I will give you the ways you can get in touch with the podcast and you can be part of the ongoing conversation that we have here on this podcast. And as we all know, I'm a national member of the Liberal Democrats. I recognise that all the three top political parties currently at the moment, top four, including Reform, are stained by a bad record of austerity. Obviously Reform hasn't been around for that long, but the policies present a state of austerity through privatisation that people are very concerned of with Reform, with privatisation to the NHS. That is in itself a form of austerity, and as I said, there is, with this current state of austerity that we look like we are in now, is a time where disabled people against cuts are really taking a stall and stand across the country in a set of different protests and political activism online and such, with the hashtags on social media. You might be familiar with welfare and not warfare and assisted living, be it for the assisted dying bill, campaigning for assisted living and improving the quality of living for disabled people, and expressing concerns about the assisted dying bill. That's with the assisted living hashtag and campaigning. And you got welfare not warfare, that you might be familiar with, seen on social media, which focuses on the recent spring statement from the Chancellor that sees, as I said, the austerity affecting disabled people in response to the increased defence spending from the Ukraine war, being needing to be more dependent on Europe and more dependent on increasing our own defence spending. And it's something that we will be talking again with Paula Peters in coming weeks on this podcast, and also to Ashley Talbot. But to talk about this week's guests, as this week's episode is called Pattern of the Assessment of the Age of Austerity and Disabled Politics and the Conservative Government, I'll be chatting to the Right Honourable Sir Robert Buckland. On introducing this episode, a guest is a former Conservative Government Minister who served in Theresa May, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson's cabinet. His career only knew life in government backbenches and the cabinet benches, only serving from 2020 to 2024 for 14 years, as he lost his seat for South Swindon and being the MP there last year. As he was on election night, he was first Conservative to lose out to a Labour candidate, losing his seat now to the now Secretary of State for Transport, Hayley Alexander. Alexandra's victory over Buckland was the first result of last year's Conservative incumbent losing seats in that anti-Conservative vote, which promised change, as I said, which argued for change over whatever tired Conservative promises you might have heard from Rishi Sunak, as people become increasingly fed up and tired with what Buckland called cheap populism, as stated on BBC with Nick Savini on BBC Wales on the election. But maybe it's to the polling success of Nigel Farage's Reform UK is how the Conservatives, Labour like are losing support now to cheap populism with new political parties and third parties that give a vessel for distrust in politics and the establishment, and to people finding a new political home. This interview on today's Politics I'm chatting with Sir Robert Buckland about his experience of being a father of an autistic daughter, and on policies that impact disabled and neurodivergent people during his time in Parliament and government. We will also be looking in relation to the economic things that we've been discussing here in this set of the introduction monologue of this episode about his review on looking at the Buckland review that was looking into autistic people in employment and what can be done to make disabled people. What the Buckland review was able to find is that, which was published in February of 2024, is that only 3 in 10 people, autistic people, are in employment, compared to 5 in 10 of all disabled people are in employment, with autistic people facing the largest pay gaps of all disabled people, and there is further disabled pay gaps compared to able non-disabled people. And when you think about that statistic, there are more autistic people out of work than in work. And for the government, they need to be able to think of how autistic people can actually be helped into work. But there is a lot of scepticism and lack of confidence from within the community. As the questions disabled people, autistic people may find is how the government intend to fix the disabled pay gap that sees disabled people, specifically autistic people, on lower income for employment in comparison to non-disabled people, and how they're going to meet the personal costs of inflation as inflation grows in the cost of living crisis, and address the additional cost of living for disabled people and accessible needs, and receive reasonable adjustments for disabled people to be able to work, in addressing the environmental issues of being able to access physical work, be it looking at how disabled people can get transport into work and out of work, and looking at how we can make sure remote working and working from home and working on the terms of autistic, neurodivergent, disabled people can be met with meeting the needs of disabled people's well-being within the economy. This is some things that the government will have to look at, and we'll be exploring how this can be done on this podcast. But let's get into this podcast interview with Robert Buckland. Do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Robert Buckland. I am a former MP and cabinet minister, and somebody who's a parent of a young adult who's autistic, and I've taken a huge interest in issues to do with neurodivergence, neurodiversity for many years, and particularly when I was in Parliament campaigning on these issues.
Do you want to tell us about how your interest in exploring neurodivergent and issues around disability started within your political career?
Yeah, it started a long time ago, 20 years ago or so, when I realized that one of my children had developmental issues, and I went through what many parents went through, which is a bit of a struggle to frankly get people to listen in the NHS and to get a diagnosis. I managed to get a diagnosis 20 years ago, but that was when we were still living in Wales. And I can tell you, at the time, there were very few girls who had a diagnosis of autism. And that wasn't because it wasn't prevalent, it was because the expertise and the knowledge about diagnosis just wasn't around. And since then, I think we've moved on a long way from autism being stereotypically viewed as a male condition, and understanding issues like masking of behaviours, and much more of a sensible and enlightened approach to the condition now, but there are still many challenges for autistic children and adults that they face daily.
And so, how did you, throughout your career, as you said, this kind of interest started 20 years ago when your child was getting diagnosed as being autistic. So, how did you start to apply that in terms of your interests in politics? How did you
Yeah.
start to explore learning yourself about autism and how it affects people, and
Yeah,
plus from the political aspects as
yeah.
well?
Yeah, it's a great question because I found that I wasn't alone. There were many other families out there who were having similar experiences. And when I became what was then the parliamentary candidate for my future constituency of South, I met a lot of other parents who were going through the same experiences that I'd gone through. And increasingly, they were coming to me for help and advice and assistance. So I set up a network, an SEN network, as I called it then, a special educational needs network for parents and families, not just about autism, but other conditions as well. And we would meet regularly in order to share best practice. We'd have guest speakers. We'd be a bit of an online network as well in terms of help for families and just a place where people could share their experiences and get support. That flourished, that went well. I then got elected as the MP here in Swindon in 2010. And I decided use the platform I had in Parliament to start campaigning about autism. And I teamed up with the National Autistic Society, with Ambitious About Autism and other charities, and eventually became chair of the all party group on autism. And that helped me amplify the platform in terms of campaigning, not just about awareness, but about services and improving legislation to support autistic children and adults.
For anyone who might not be familiar with all-party political groups, do you want to explain about the all-party political
Yeah.
group for autism and the other things of how you started in Parliament when you
Yeah.
started your career in terms of exploring autism?
Yeah, the All Party Group, there's a lot of them. They're not official bodies within Parliament, but they are voluntary groups involving MPs and indeed members of the House of Lords of all parties who come together on a particular subject issue of interest. And the autism group's been going for a long time. It's been chaired by a number of people, not just me, but the late great Dame Cheryl Gillen, former Conservative MP, who was the mover and shaker behind the Autism Act of 2009, the first condition specific piece of legislation relating to health and outcomes in this country. And the group works, that is, with existing charities like the National Autistic Society and others who provide a supporting secretariat. And together, priorities are agreed, meetings are held, events are held with a view to highlight particular issues in education or in employment. And it's a very useful campaigning platform, I think. And I know those who are involved value its role. And of course, it continues. I'm not there now, but it continues now under new chairmanship. And I'm sure it'll carry on with that campaigning role. And I think that looking back at my time, he was very proud to help push for guidelines, clinical guidelines for the support of children and adults who are autistic in England. Of course, it applied in England. Wales, of course, has a separate system, but similar principles apply. And I managed through campaigning to get the authorities here in the health service to issue those important guidelines, which of course help commissioning bodies, local primary care bodies, and other health agencies look to do the right thing by providing services that actually meet the needs of autistic people. So that was a big step forward about 10 or more years ago, and a lot of work since in order to campaign on this important issue.
Yeah, because that is something that when I've been doing my podcast interviews, which I've done quite many since 2020, and one of the thing is I tend to like to ask people what type of change as a neurodivergent person you want to see done. And that is something that kind of touches upon, that brings up in a lot when I ask that question, is like the further redness, which the guidelines link to. But that is something that is still
Mm,
an ongoing concern and interest for people still
mm.
wanting further awareness, be that through like medical settings or to other aspects of like from engaging in public spaces or in education.
That's right. And in particular, in child and adolescent mental health, when I started, a lot of services weren't tailored to autistic young people who would very often find it just too much to come to a clinic or a surgery. The anxiety levels would be too high. They either wouldn't be able to come, or when they did, the anxiety had kicked in so much that they weren't able to engage. And therefore, working out how you reach people in their own environment, in a safe space where they don't feel anxious, was very important. I would say, I think that this type of medium now, which we've got used to since COVID, the online discussion and the use of technology like this, really does help a lot of autistic people who can be in the comfort of their familiar surroundings and yet communicate with professionals and others in a way that I think minimizes that ever-present issue of anxiety. And that's why I think modeling services around the person, the user, has to be the way forward if we're going to reach out to as many people as possible, because there are a lot of people out there with a condition who either don't have a diagnosis or who have a diagnosis and are not getting any support to help them navigate life. And that seems to me to be a wicked waste of opportunity and resource. And that's why in my later years in Parliament, I really worked on issues relating to employment opportunities for autistic adults, which culminated in a report that was published in my name last year.
Yeah. So and I know going on to the report, what are the kind of key things that you found from it? And as you said, it's like a report you did on autistic people in employment and, the employment opportunities for autistic people with, as well as exploring other learning disabilities that, can that were included in the report.
Yeah.
So can you give them a bit more details as to that report?
Yeah, so the report was the culmination of about a year's work of roundtables, consultations, calls for evidence involving hundreds of different organisations and indeed individuals, many of whom have deep and long specialism in autism and employment issues, and of course, many of whom are autistic themselves. Because I was determined that although the independent review was in my name, it had to be led by autistic people. And that's why, although I worked with the Department of Work and Pensions and I had a team of civil servants to support me, the research charity with which many listeners will be familiar was involved directly. And that meant that from the get go, autistic people had a say, and more than a say, they could help shape what was to come. And the recommendations that we produced, about 19 in all, are very much geared towards practical solutions. It's not about more laws and more money from government. It's about getting culture change much more widely embedded amongst a whole range of different employers and businesses. Now, we found plenty of examples of good practice. I thought the insurance industry was particularly good at harnessing neurodiverse and neurodivergent people in a supportive way. And I think that also we had a very good set of experiences from organizations like DFN Project Search, and indeed Autistica themselves with their index on autism, which I think point the way to how interview techniques and support techniques can be changed in order to, first of all, recruit autistic people and then to retain them. One of the big areas I think that there does need to be change is in making sure that the recruitment agencies that do so much of the heavy lifting for small and medium-sized businesses, those agencies that are on every high street in every town in Britain, sift through the applications and do the preliminary work. They need to have the training to be not just aware, but also to tailor some of their questions and their techniques to support and actively include neurodivergent and autistic people. And I think with that culture change, you can start to see these patches of really good practice becoming the norm. And whilst that might sound very ambitious, I think that the report needs to be followed up by one of our key recommendations, which was to set up a task group, and that task group to be very much led and including autistic people to set some targets for improving that gap of employment, because only 3 out of 10 at the moment autistic adults are in work. We need to push that up to the disability average of 5 out of 10 and probably higher, in my view. And we need to set some targets. And I hope this government will get on with it. I have spoken to the new ministers and I've pulled their chain again only last week, and I want to make sure that they're getting on with the recommendations and helping to close that gap that means that so many adults are just not having the chance they deserve.
On your time in government, when a time you worked when there was a Conservative government of your own party, and as between your time as backbencher and as cabinet minister, what are the things do you think that you were able to work constructively with the government, and do you think the government did actually deliver on what you wanted for neurodivergent and autistic people?
I'm really proud of the record, actually, of progress that we made over the last 14 or so years. I think that the Autism Act itself, there are still aspects of the practical applicability of the Act that I think leave something to be desired. But that's more to do with, I think, capacity and training of professionals. I'm very proud of the Children and Families Act when we reformed the statementing procedure to create education, health, and care plans. But again, frustrated that some of the clear intentions that we set out when we were doing that bill have not been followed through, and there's still too much of a struggle, mainly because I think the health end of services does not properly engage. But I've noticed a difference, particularly for older youngsters, that getting that support beyond 18 has made with regard to special needs provision in particular. So I thought that was a very important landmark. Though I think the current review into SEN is vital and could yield some new progress for autism. I'm also I was Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary by issuing a call for evidence about neurodivergence and neurodiversity in the criminal justice system. And that was led by Charlie Taylor, who's the independent inspector of prisons in England and Wales. Charlie Taylor used to be a head and a teacher in SEN, and his specialist knowledge in autism was one of the reasons why I recommended him to be inspector, because I knew this was a man who, for the first time, really understood autism. And I can tell you his findings and his report that he did has led to change in our prisons, in that we now have in every prison a neurodiversity lead within the management structure to really focus upon what those prisons are doing to support the very high preponderance of neurodivergent prisoners who are in the system. And that's not a coincidence. That is because I sincerely believe that a lot of people with these undiagnosed needs and conditions have really ended up in the system in a way that we could have prevented if we'd taken earlier action, either in health or in education. And that's why this issue isn't just about criminal justice, it's about the whole system and its failure to intervene at the right stages to support people with needs that could be met and which could allow them to lead fulfilling lives.
As you said then, that one thing is you felt that there could have been more done to prevent the autistic people from going into being imprisoned because of varying things that could have been done in health and education, and possibly in areas around economic inequalities. Is there anything that you feel that you wish that the government over the last 14 years, when you was in the Conservative government, you wished your government would have gone further on?
Look, I think that there are times when I think every government, you can look at every government and say they should have gone further. I think that one of the constraints is that the demand that there is for more services to support autism can't be met by the supply of clinicians or professionals out there. I used to regularly talk to my local child and adolescent mental health teams, and it wasn't so much the funding was there, it was getting the expertise in, and the particular autism expertise that you can't just create overnight. You have to train the people up, and that can take years. And I think that therefore, what we need to do, and what I think there could have been more emphasis on, is that general basic training across the piece, so that every teacher, teaching assistant, health professional had at least a basic understanding of what autism was about and how to respond to it. And I think that creating that sort of a system won't just then deal with this rather artificial funnel we have through which people will have to first of all get a diagnosis and then get an EHCP, a plan, in order to get statutory services, but to reach out to those people perhaps who haven't had a diagnosis, but who are displaying some of the behaviours and hallmarks although I always avoid stereotypes when it comes to autism. There's no such thing as a typical autistic person. When you
Yeah.
met one autistic person, you met one autistic person. We've got to avoid that. But there are techniques and methods and mechanisms that I know can work and which we need to spread out as best practice amongst our mainstream services. And that's got to include health as well. Health can't absent themselves from the table. Over the years, they've always regarded themselves, because of their financial privileges, as separate from the rest of the system. I think trying to end that exclusivity is very important if we're really to create services that exist around their client, as opposed to having to reinvent the wheel, which is a common problem for autistic people and their families, having to re-explain themselves too many times to the authorities in a way that can really lead to finally a lack of engagement with services, because there's a understanding loss of confidence that is felt by autistic people.
So I guess what you wished for is a better, easier navigation of a complex system for things to be simplified for the autistic person and their
Yeah.
family. Yeah. And so when also you might have been met as with like criticisms from autistic and neurodivergent disabled people within the last 14 years of prior to this Labour government, of allegations of like austerity and concerns of that. In terms of
Mm.
like of other autistic people who might have spoken to you at your time of doing certain reports, have you been able to address or considered the concerns of different disability advocacy and activist groups and activist individuals when they have
Oh, yeah.
concerns around the Conservative government?
Very much. And local advocacy services, we're lucky here in Swindon, we've got one which helps adults with learning disabilities and autism. Having that sort of provision is very important, I think. I would say, and this is what I always said to campaign groups, stop looking at autism as a problem, as some sort of disaster or terrible affliction. For a lot of autistic people, it has its challenges, and we all know the barriers, but ultimately it is a gift. It is a gift. And sometimes it's a very well disguised gift. I accept that. But the autistic mind can think in ways that neurotypical people just don't. And I always said that whilst I'm a great believer in making sure that the PIP process was fair, that the invisible disability issue was dealt with properly, and we did fight long and hard to make sure that was the case. And I think the PIP system actually was better than the ODLA. And I think with all the glitches that we had, I think that inevitably the benefit system is going to come under pressure at a time when public spending is going to be tight. It's going to happen again with this government. They're going to have to at some point. In fact, they're inevitably going to start looking again at benefits, I would think. And of course, for autistic people for whom anxiety is always just around the corner or present, that's particularly hard. And getting policymakers and decision makers to understand that, I think, was an ever constant battle, certainly for me in my constituency MP role in supporting people through the process. But look, you can criticize governments of all stripes. And I think that for all the imperfections, and it wasn't perfect, I don't think anybody should ever pretend that any government's perfect, even when they're in it. I think we've come on a long way in 15 years, 14 years from where we were in 2010. I think this country is more aware and more understanding of autism than it's ever been. And I think of the developed nations, I would much rather take my autistic daughter through a British airport or into a British government agency than I would elsewhere in Europe, because I notice a much greater awareness and understanding of her condition from officials and others with that responsibility than I do in other countries. So I think that whilst we've still got work to do, I would say that the Anglo-American sphere, and America particularly with its research funding power, is probably amongst the best places in the world at the moment to be autistic. But that doesn't mean we should be complacent. We've got a lot of work to do, but we've got to use the work that we've done as an example so that other countries follow suit, so that there's a truly international approach to making sure that autistic people not just have the rights that they deserve, but have the life that they deserve.
Yeah.
And that's a mainstream life, not special privileges or being treated as a sort of category apart from everybody else, mainstreaming it so that autistic people can be seen in all their glory with all the attributes they have and all the gifts that they possess. And it's that positive approach, I think, that we need to take. And we owe it to autistic people to support them in that way.
One thing I find a lot is when we talk to different autistic people is the thing that they wish to see the autism not just as a gift or not as a hindrance, but just as being autistic in a more neutral perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, and Roy also was hinting then in terms of highlighting the criticisms that autistic people and disabled people might themselves, to the certain activism groups who might really criticise not so much of seeing autism and disability as a problem, but to have a look at the certain cuts and talks about cuts and austerity in terms of pensions or benefits cuts and how that can impact disabled people, especially when, as you say, when workplaces have been inaccessible for disabled people, and at a time when we still got a time to get to the point where all autistic people can get greater access to workplaces, and when certain benefits don't always meet up with the rise in inflation. So how have you been able to look at the talk
Um,
of benefit cuts?
Look, I really am very keen to move this debate on, not because it's convenient, but because I think it's not great for autistic and disabled people always to be viewed through the prism of what government can do for them and benefits. It should be about how individual needs are supported into employment so that, for example, you don't get to this artificial disincentive, which does happen, where a part-time job can often lead to a drop in income rather than an increase. That sort of anomaly has to be dealt with by government. In other words, the work that was being done by the previous government to preserve benefit entitlements for disabled people who then were going into work seems to me to be vital. We've got to avoid this cut-off thing where you do more than 16 hours, then that's it. It's crazy.
Mhm.
It's crazy. We need to passport the system so that there's a mixed economy, so that, yes, there will be some benefits and some support from government in order to guarantee that the income that isn't required to be able to get through the week. But at the same time, then not this artificial punishment, frankly, or this downturn, this cliff edge when it comes to being able to actually get work. And that's achievable. It's got to be doable. In this age where we're increasingly moving to a digitalized system, we've got technologies out there that can help increase the efficiency of our data and the way that we process things. Why can't we start to create individual bespoke passporting for disabled people so that they get that package and that it can be adjusted in real time according to what work they may or may not be doing? I think that's a much more constructive approach than, I think, always resorting to the issue about it's the government who is in effect able to control my life. Uh, I certainly feel very much for my friends, my disabled friends, who I just want them to have the same opportunities that I've got. And I know that's what they want. They
Yeah,
want to be mainstreamed. And I like your point. I talk about it being a gift, mainly because I'm trying to counterweight this prevailing view that it's like an illness or a problem. I'm saying, no, not everybody
yeah,
thinks of it like that. But if we can get to a stage where you, as you said, it's neutral, it's I'm autistic, I've got blue eyes, I've got brown eyes, fantastic. I think working to that will only happen if people like me accentuate the positives about autism and get people to think in a different way about a condition that empowered people like Bill Gates, didn't they? Didn't it, at the top end of the spectrum, who for people who perhaps have comorbid and other impairments and other conditions, life can be more challenging. And I think one of the things I have tried to do is get people to not just focus upon the very gifted, but upon people who might be at a different part of the spectrum and who have other impairments, but for whom life means that it is a bit more of a challenge. And I think that for that, we've got to work very hard to make sure that they are given employment chances as well.
so meeting the level of high and low support
Yeah,
needs really as
yeah,
the typical scripts now levels the spectrum. But in terms of, as you said, about the face passport, and in terms of that when people get, and there's still issues with employment that will be addressed in the long term. And like there is the additional cost of being disabled, and as the higher support needs go up, that cost of disabled income cost for being disabled increases.
Yeah.
What are the things that, if it wasn't for government, what would be the alternatives then,
Well,
as you referenced bespoke passporting?
look, I think you've got to just do. A lot of people in politics do not understand the difference between PIP and other types of benefit. When I say to people, PIP is not a means tested benefit, they look at me as if I'm daft. I explain to them that it's based upon the needs of the disabled person, and it's designed in order to make sure that the extra costs that inevitably are incurred by disabled people, the extra transport and travel costs, for example, the need to have perhaps somebody with you at a particular event, which means you've got to then pay more. You know, the whole point of PIP is designed to level the playing field so that those extra costs are then met through the PIP, and the money that otherwise would make it prohibitive is there to ensure that people who are disabled have access to the same services. And that's why PIP is very important. And attempts to try and means test it were ones that I
Yeah,
always resisted strongly, because however, whatever family background disabled people come from, the money's for them, the disabled person themselves, and their freedom to do things which otherwise would be inhibited. Now, I think you therefore have to really make that clear and keep that as a principle. But then when it comes to the employment and income related benefits, the other stuff under universal credit, I do think that there have to be ways in which there can be a better passporting and a calibration to allow more part-time work. That means that disabled people aren't then put at a disadvantage. And again, the principle has to be the same. It's not about giving them privileged access, it's about making sure they have the same access as anybody else, which is all they ask for. And we have lots of arguments about ableism. Look, I agree with it. I think that all of us kid ourselves when we talk about this binary division between ability and disability. There's no such thing, in my view. Everything's on a spectrum, and all of us, to some extent or other, will have an impairment. I've got a hearing impairment, which is why I wear hearing aids, though nobody can see them. I've got a visual impairment because I wear glasses. I can't see without my glasses. But that is of a nature and degree that I can manage myself. Therefore, it's about degree, it seems to me. And therefore, if we start to look at it through that prism, much as we've done with other types of heuristic that is protected under the Equalities Act, I think we'll be in a much better place. And the more that we can accept this sort of spectrum approach, then the more we have a chance to end the cliff edge between income from employment and the loss of a benefit as a result of that. And that's where we need to be going now.
yeah. And when you mentioned about PAP, but one of the things that disabled people find is that it can be quite a challenge to access, depending on like how much the questions can integrate, or you're not always not phrased in a way that allows them to be truthful and honest in terms of describing their real life and what they need and how to meet their needs. But also, it can be the thing that where people have the need for receiving the benefits, but not accept them for first going, I need to be doing certain, take that, tribunals and other stuff
Yeah,
like
the tribunal issue was always one that concerned me because the number of cases of tribunal that were successful was overwhelming. But that tells you that the different way in which the tribunal operates the initial assessment is where the problem lies. And my argument was always get the initial assessment right. And look, a lot of it depends on evidence. And if you don't provide the evidence that is needed for the initial assessment, then don't be surprised if things don't go right. But that's where I think advocacy networks, support networks, talking to people with that experience of negotiating the benefit system, that's where that comes into play. And the best way to reduce the number of appeals is to improve the quality of initial applications. And that's why I think advocacy services are so important in order to get the initial decision. I found that time after time that applications were made, And then obvious, or I say obvious, perhaps to me it would be obvious, but not everybody's a lawyer like me, important pieces of evidence were not submitted. And I think trying to get that system sorted out at the first instance, I think, is a very important part of reducing the pressure and the anxiety that is such an ever-present part of the life of many autistic people.
Yeah, and I think it's for disabled people, they do want a bit more of a simplified process of
Mm.
providing evidence, or like a bit more of a simplified like documentation from the end of disability without having so much extensive information or packets of information they have to provide. And
Mm.
by going back a second, when you said about how one of the other places might be more easier to be more inclusive to be a
Oh,
neurodivergent or autistic would be America. But in terms like the certain things that we have around the Trump presidency as well, and the disinformation around that, and also the social media's rules have relaxed since Trump has got to office.
yeah,
Do you have concerns around
sure.
that?
Huge concerns. I support an organisation called Full Fact, which is a UK charity that used to be one of the organisations supporting Meta, which of course runs Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, in their service, which they've now discontinued after 6 years of making corrections and providing factual information. I think it's a terrible moment. I think it's really important that social media platforms are responsible. And it's not about being left wing or right wing. It's about providing objective facts. And of course, it's very important for disabled people as well to know that what they're reading can be relied upon. My advice to everybody is that you should always verify what you read, check it out from another source. If you see it on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, have a look on the BBC or another website to see whether it's actually happening. Don't just take their word for it. And I do think that the truth is a very important commodity, and politicians and social media giants play around with it at their peril, at our peril. And that's why I think objectivity and truth is something we've got to strive for and fight for. And that's why I'm supporting Full Fact in their work. They do a lot of fact checking, and their website is not party political, it's a non political website, but it's a really good place to just check if certain things are actually accurate or true. And the more we have organizations like them out there, then the better we will be. But faced against the big might of the big tech giants, the battle for truth is going to be a very important one in the next few years.
Yeah, and also one of the things I wanted to ask you is, for what were the things that made you interested in politics, to go into a political career and become an
Mm.
MP? And what are the things that made you decide on becoming a Conservative Party member?
Oh, yeah. I was always a conservative. I always believed that the best way forward for society in our country is a combined effort that involves some government, of course, but ultimately relies upon the initiative and enterprise of us, the people, families, communities, individuals, businesses who make the wealth of this country. It's not governments that make the wealth, it's the businesses and industries and the capacity of our people that make our wealth. And I have always believed that we achieve that better with the conservative approach, and that the alternative is always leads to higher unemployment, more tax, and frankly, the lowest common denominator, which I don't think is a good enough approach to the future of our society. Yes, there will be times when there will be differences and some inequalities, but that's where the welfare state comes in and the safety net is so important to me. But unless you have an environment where people are free to prosper and to succeed and to create the wealth that is so important to pay for our public services, then a country like ours will not carry on as it has done. We've got choices to make. We are spending beyond our means, and we need some very clear leadership, which we're not getting at the moment. I went into politics because I'm not somebody that likes to sit on the sidelines. I've got a lot of ideas about the future of our country, and therefore I thought it was my duty to get involved. And that's why I did. And I have no regrets about it, even though at the moment I'm not in elected office. I'm still a very political animal, and I still have very strong views about the future of my country and why I believe it's still a great place to live and will be a greater place still if we get things right. And that's why I'm a bit frustrated. You're probably going to hear that in my voice. I'm frustrated with this government. I'm frustrated by the likes of Donald Trump, who I don't approve of. And I'm frustrated by the lack of leadership I see in world affairs, bearing in mind the challenge we face from social media, the rise of AI, which can be a very good thing and a powerful thing, but we've got to make sure that the ethics of it are right. And indeed, the constant challenge of dictatorships like Russia and China. And it's a very difficult world in which we're living. And it hasn't been like this really since the end of the Cold War. And that's why the leadership that we need now is very important. And I'm worried that we're not getting that degree of leadership that I think we need.
What do you mean frustrations with this government?
Look, I think they've got in with a big majority, but they're not governing like that, and they don't seem to know what they want. I was very critical of them before the election when I said they didn't have a plan. And now I'm afraid it's been revealed they really didn't have a plan. The only plan they had was one to win by saying nothing. And I thought perhaps that was because they were going to reveal things afterwards. But what they've revealed is basically what they're told to say by civil servants. And I don't blame the civil servants, by the way. But I do blame the politicians. It's only now that they're scrabbling around for ideas to try and grow our economy. That work should have been done before they came in, and they should have had a very clear idea about what it is that drives economic growth. And I can tell you that taxing jobs is not the way to do it. It's going to lead to more unemployment, and that's not good for any of us. And frankly, it's a disincentive to the growth that they want. So I'm finding too many mixed messages from this new government and a lack of real clarity as to what it is they want to do. They take away winter fuel payments with one hand, they tax jobs with the other, and then they tell us they want to support people and grow the economy. Which is it? I'm very confused as to what, and I think they are as well.
And because previously it was the case that you didn't, unlike some of your colleagues, you didn't resign your seat and stood down at the last election, but you were ousted. What were the main reasons you feel that you were ousted as, for Swindon South?
I don't think it was personal. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. If it had been personal, actually, I had a personal vote here. People were saying they were voting for me because of my work on local issues, on casework, on helping people with problems. There was a national feeling that the Conservatives had had their time and they had to go. And I think that vote was like a big referendum on the Conservatives, which was, we don't want you anymore, rather than a vote of confidence in a new government. The share of the vote that Labour had was only 34%, and yet they got a very big majority. That's a bit of a problem for them. And I think perhaps that has been why they've been held back and they're unsure of themselves. But I certainly think that the last election was very clear that the self-inflicted wounds and all the divisions that had occurred, the mistakes that had been made by previous prime ministers were the issues that people decided to punish us for. And they're not wrong. The British public are never wrong. It's no good criticising them. We have to now look at ourselves, and the new leader is indeed doing that. Kemi Badenoch's doing that and rebuilding. But that takes time, and they've got to be very patient before they will have a chance at hopefully having the privilege of forming another government one day.
Yeah, because I know it's like for many people as well, the disabled community, there was a lot of frustrations with the COVID pandemic and the levels of deaths that occurred, but also the kind of hypocrisy of government for the lockdown deals.
You're right, and that was a totally avoidable. Should never have happened, and the way it was then handled was again very bad. I look back at that period. I was having the responsibility for courts and prisons, and I made sure that we didn't end up with COVID killing a large part of the population in prisons, which it could have done. We managed to keep it out through very careful management. And the courts were under huge pressure, and that still goes on now. But there were large parts of the British state that worked very well during COVID, and our vaccine rollout was the best in Europe. And actually, when you look at the figures and you look at those excess death figures, Britain is somewhere in the middle now. At the time, we were beating ourselves up by saying we were the worst. Actually, the reality is somewhat different. And I think no country faced with that unprecedented challenge was ever going to be totally ready. And we've got an inquiry going on, and I'm sure they'll come up with lots of important recommendations about public health measures. But I do not think that the big headline measures that we took to save jobs and to intervene to protect the economy, they all had to be done. But there's a cost to that. And that's what people perhaps have forgotten. That they seem to think that the $500 billion we spent was not going to be accounted for. It is. And we've got to try and work out a way in which we bring that debt down so that we don't end up just spending money on interest rates and loans rather than actual public services. And that's the reality. And I think few politicians of all sides are prepared to talk frankly about the choices that we have to make, which are very difficult. And some people aren't going to like them. But you've got to have that honesty in politics.
Yeah, because in fairness, the pandemic is a hard thing to plan to decide on the politics of and the decisions to be made. But I guess it might be the thing that for looking at things might have happened, there might be some sort of regret that things might have been better planned for, but things could have been done a bit better. Yeah, I guess that might be the case.
Of course. And I know plenty of families who were affected by it and were bereaved by it. And I've been to the wall in London to reflect and look at it. And for many people, it was a dreadful experience. And some people are still living with the consequences of it now. I think all of us were changed. All of it. And I had COVID like many other people. It's changed all of us. And I think understanding that is part of the process. I've got to disappear very shortly.
All right, yes.
Another commitment, but it's been lovely talking to you. And thank you so much for inviting me on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Is there any last things you wish to say?
No, I just want to say thank you very much. A big diolch yn fawr, thank you for inviting me on. And I wish you well. And I wish everybody watching and listening well. And I'm going to, although I'm now an ordinary private citizen, I'm going to carry on with the campaigning that I want to do to try and make sure that we close that gap and that more autistic people have a chance to work and to do something that they want to do. And that's going to keep me going, I think, for a long time to come.
Thanks again for Sir Robert for coming on this podcast to chat to myself about his tenure in Parliament and his thoughts as a parent of an autistic child. This, I can admit, is the first time on this podcast I've had a politician who's been elected to a national parliament, be it a former politician who has served as an MP, let alone speaking to somebody who has been in the cabinet position on this podcast. I'm not someone who has had any experience of doing interviewing and media before, beyond setting up this podcast, and I always appreciate of people who are willing to come on and chat to me. I find it's not the most natural thing for me to do, as I sometimes find I'm stumbling over words and all that. Still trying to figure out this podcasting thing, as even though I started this almost 5 years ago of podcasting, but like I'm practicing for doing interviews and dazzling listeners and viewers. I know you may have had things that you wish that I had said or asked Sir Robert. I know there's probably a million and things that I could have asked him and explored in this interview about his time in government and his parliamentary career. But I will say, anyway, this interview was recorded before the spring statement and the announcement of the green paper of the pathways to work. But what I will say now is that, as I said, I hope you found this to be a fair and balanced reflection of a conversation with somebody who I know will make of having a discussion of different people from different political parties and people from different political spectrums, as I find it's important to offer a fair and balanced and somewhat impartial but honest and transparent view of politics on this podcast. As I said, if you have any feedback on this interview, and if you can please give me feedback at newerrainbow@newerrainbowproject.com and send your thoughts, feedback, stories, questions for future episodes of DisElectAbility anything you can let me know, please give me an email about this podcast. Also, please share this podcast, give it a review, and subscribe to this, and follow on Blue Sky at newerrainbowproject.com. On the next episode of the podcast, I will be chatting to Ashley Talbot, the co-founder of Autotrans. She is somebody who lives with MS. We will be chatting about transphobia in the media, trans healthcare, the state of government benefits reforms, and various Streeton's proposed changes to NHS England. Thank you for listening and viewing. Goodbye.